Welcome to the Cold Steel Surgical Podcast with your hosts Amir Farouk and Chad Ball.
On this episode, we had the opportunity to speak with Beverly Blaney. Bev is a psychotherapist who has extensive experience doing therapy with physicians in particular, as well as conducting workshops on mindfulness for Queen's School of Medicine. We asked her about her perspective on the psychological challenges surgeons experience during their training and her thoughts on what we could do to make ourselves more resilient in a system that doesn't lend itself to protecting our own physical and mental well-being. Bev, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. We really appreciate you spending the time, especially so late at night, to come and chat with us about some topics that are really near and dear to us here on the podcast. And we'll get into it a little bit more here as we go on. But maybe you could just start out by telling us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, and where you did your training.
Well, first of all, thank you for asking me. I think this is such an important area to talk about. And, I really think supporting doctors and medical professionals is incredibly important. So thank you for asking me to be here. I grew up in Kingston. My undergraduate work was at Queen's. Most of my graduate work has been in various locations throughout the States. So I did a 3-year degree in Gestalt therapy in Cleveland and did my CBT in Philadelphia at the Beck Institute. And then most of my other therapy was, across the United States. A lot of mindfulness training and self-compassion and yoga. And so I did a master's in education at Queen's too, because I really cared about how people learn and how to teach. And so that kind of brought me into the School of Medicine. And I worked for Queen's School of Medicine as providing therapy to medical trainees for quite a long time. And then I semi-retired, and then I just continued with private practice through medical training and sort of saw it from the inside. And then when I graduated from my studies, I went to work at Hotel Dieu. I was working in adult and child and adolescent psychiatry. So, and then from there, John and I got really interested in trying to support medical trainees and got involved with the mindfulness aspect of it. We sort of developed and offered the first program in mindfulness at Queen's. And we did that for a long time. And I think it was pretty helpful for most people. So when we were just doing it, it was kind of a rare bird, but it's become more prominent and dominant. And so there's lots of people to take that over, which is great. So when we stepped back, we knew it was in good hands.
That's so interesting. You saw it from the inside and from a more professional viewpoint. This is a ridiculous 30,000 foot broad question, but what is it that you saw as, he went through training, and what do you see now from such a highly skilled professional point of view in regards to the training pathway? What are some of those common themes and I guess potentially struggles as well?
Well, I really initially saw it from a very personal perspective. Queen's School of Medicine had asked me to provide therapy. So I actually got to sit across from a lot of doctors and residents. And so I really got to hear their stories. So I started to understand that it's, the old expression, the personal is political. And I really got to sort of see that it wasn't, just our particular situation, but it's an incredibly demanding occupation. And I understand why it is and why it probably has to be, but it does take a lot. It's a big sacrifice. It's a sacrifice not only for the doctor, but for his entire family. So, it's sort of like a one-way street when you're a medical trainee. It's like, you're always giving. There's always someone sick. And for me, it's really important that we make sure that we are supporting and giving back to our doctors, because no culture is going to be any healthier than its healers. And so I really know professionally and personally what a toll it can take on physicians and their families. So you don't turn it off when you go home. Like, especially, I mean, John was a subspecialist. He's the only one in Kingston. And so, I mean, training was bad. It was 1 in 3 call with no post call. But then if you come to a center and you're the only subspecialist, it goes from 1 in 3 to 24/7. And that's really hard to sustain for people for many, many years.
Bev, we've talked about this a little bit in the past, but and you've sort of touched on it here, but what do you think that does to someone when they're in that mindset and in that culture? I think well-meaning in that we really are dedicated to our training and dedicated to becoming good. Like, Dr. Ball's sitting here. He's in one of my mentors. And, one of the things I took away from him is that, you really have to be the best that you can be. Like every bit of it matters. There's no step that is inconsequential. There's no aspect of that doesn't matter. But what do you think what impact does that have on us as human beings, sort of after being in that mindset for a long period of time?
I don't know. This may happen in any kind of job where it's actually more of a vocation than a job, right? But, for medicine, what I observed and have heard, it's like, it's kind of a exquisite long-term training in self-abuse or self-denial. You stay up all night, so you're exhausted very often. And, even like really basic things like, going to the bathroom and eating and just the sleep deprivation for sure. I mean, it can really deplete someone. And I'm not sure that from what I saw, there's an equal balance in self-care for them. That's certainly not often provided by the training program, but I mean, it's kind of, they talk about it. Like you're supposed to have a work-life balance. They certainly talk about it, but often that's just like another task okay, so I've got to do all this, and on top of this, I have to have a work-life balance, right? And it felt very often. And I mean, I participated in those, workshops and everything, but I really often came away feeling like we've just put more of a demand on doctors, because not only do you have to give, but then you're supposed to somehow miraculously be able to sustain and nurture yourself as well. So, I really don't know why it tends to be that way. I mean, and I only understand this from sort of looking in. I've never set up a training program for medicine, and I'm sure that there's demands that are inherent that can't be avoided, but so I don't know if it's the system or how it's delivered, but often it kind of does feel like I went to my doctor's office last week, and there was this lovely, beautiful, brilliant young resident in family medicine, and she's bushy-tailed and full of excitement and energy and enthusiasm, and it was just so lovely to see. But on the same hand, I sort of like, I don't want to come back 10 years from now and see you, sweetheart. I don't know. I don't know if it has to be that way. I'm afraid I'm kind of the kind of person that doesn't believe it has to be that way. But maybe it will take us time to develop a more evenly balanced system. I think we need to find a way to help provide more support instead of just always sucking the energy out. I mean, I've never met a doctor that wasn't really dedicated and really cared about his patients and really wanted to provide excellent care. I have seen people who are burnt out, and it's really hard because they usually take it as a personal failure. They're really not likely to, blame the system so much as themselves. So I guess I kind of think it's probably more the system than the individual.
That's a really interesting point of view. And I think Amir and I would both say we would totally agree with you. And this may be an unfair question. And if it is, please sort of tell me to go away. But is there comparators in other fields? So if we look at the business world and someone trying to run a small business and the hours that they may work and the stress that comes with that, or maybe a professional athlete, certainly the levels of support, both physical and psychological, vary tremendously across those three sort of silly examples. But what's your sense of where medicine, and particularly surgery, fits into the sort of the greater world in terms of some of these challenges and some of these topics?
I grew up in a family that had a family business. And so hairdressing was one side of it. My parents also opened a flower shop. And I worked in that business for 10 years before I went off for training. And so I was used to 18-hour days, and working really, really hard and wanting so much to be successful. But it wasn't nearly as exhausting. Personally, I think the difference, what really changes it is, if I don't get somebody's flower arrangement out on time, it's not a big deal. If you guys don't do a good job, someone might die. And I really think that you're holding someone's life in your hands often. It's a tremendous burden. You're basically holding a family's heart in your hand. And nobody wants to fail. I mean, you didn't put the guy on the table, but I spoke to surgeons when it hasn't gone well. And, I think they take on a tremendous amount of feeling of responsibility for the outcome, and which is, I think, over exaggerated. I mean, like I said, I think sometimes they forget that they didn't put the person on the table, but surgeons give them a chance to get off the table and join their families again. But it really is that life-death outcome that I think is exhausting in a way that, just putting in an 18-hour day isn't,
Bev, obviously you've worked with medical students and physicians for a long time. What sort of common things would you see that, if you can talk about it, what sort of common things would you see happen to physicians that would kind of bring them into your office, so to speak?
Well, I think anxiety is probably one piece of it, because that can be quite debilitating and really undermining. And burnout, for sure. I mean, and depression. Sometimes maladaptive coping strategies, drinking, eating disorders, things like that.
Obviously, we were chatting a little bit before we started recording that burnout is something that's really entered the zeitgeist for medicine. It's something that I think a lot more people talk about now, maybe than maybe 20 years ago. When you say the word burnout, or you think about this idea of burnout, what does that mean to you? And what does that really look like? Because I think it means a lot of different things, a lot of different people. And one of the reasons why it's really on my mind is the New England Journal of Medicine editor, one of the associate editors, released this kind of like her own thoughts. I think, what's it called? I think her podcast is called Not Otherwise Specified, which is kind of funny. But she was talking all about like how she really didn't think it was possible to train people without really being rigorous and without getting into the whole thing. I think a lot of people really like had a visceral reaction to that. And a lot of people were saying, well, just because you can have a life outside of medicine doesn't mean that we shouldn't. And, there was a big reaction, as you can imagine, on social media. And obviously one of our interests on the podcast has been exploring this topic of burnout. So from your lens, what does the word burnout mean and what does it look like?
Well, I think it can manifest differently for different people, obviously. That sort of slow retreat and withdrawal from being sort of in the world to sort of being really shut off and isolated, and really often just incredible sense of guilt people can feel. And it's like de-skilling and disabling. And there's a greater sense than just being depressed or anxious. It's really that disconnection and an inability to focus and to be present with others and be really in the world. That lack of connection that can happen. I get like what you're doing is really difficult. Of course, it takes a tremendous amount of training and focus and attention. I kind of just like, I've worked with residents that feel incredibly guilty about stepping back because they know when they step back, their colleagues have to pick up the slack. And if they're exhausted from it and then you're down a resident, it's going to be much, much worse. And that's true for people who are on staff. Like often they're really reluctant to take off the time they need to get better because of the burden they place on their colleagues. So that you have a lot of guilt and a lot of shame layered into that as well. And everybody else seems to be coping. And so they feel like, what's wrong with me? Everybody else can do this. I should be able to too. Or even like they all do, push themselves hard and work hard. Like can't be a slacker. But burnout is quite different than just, it's way more obvious when you're sitting across from somebody and there's that total disconnect and isolation, and you just feel like they're in a huge black hole. And it's like, really shut off. Like I get more worried when people wait too long to step back because there's always the fear of suicide, right? And a lot of us go that way or get involved with drugs and alcohol. And
that's a very powerful descriptor and sort of viewpoint for sure. And it's something that I think, as you know, a lot of us can lack insight into in real time. And I think from this side of the curtain, I think as a group, we do a really, really poor job of recognition of people in distress in that scenario, of addressing it or interacting with them, and then trying to make things better in whatever individual or system way that we can. And I would argue there's lots of excuses, and you're so kind. You've probably heard them all, but everyone's busy or all demands here and there. But at the end of the day, I think at least I would say locally, and in my experience in the places I've been and trained and worked, we do a really poor job of addressing all of those issues.
I think colleagues, when they see it, are like really want to help and really want their colleague to take the time off, and they don't want them to feel guilty. And they're, in my experience, have always been really supportive in terms of, no, it's okay, we'll manage. But despite that, I think on an individual level, there's a sense that you've let the team down. And, it's almost like by the time people graduate, they've lost their ability to sort of understand that they have to be taken care of too. There's times when they could be a patient as well, so it's not always, I think, who they're working with, because I think I've seen people be incredibly generous towards sick colleagues. There are some restrictions, like John was the only subspecialist here. He recently retired and they replaced him with two. And He'd worked for 30 years, that's one. And the guy coming in said, I don't know how he did it because we would have had three. But, so maybe there's some kind of shortage in terms of financially. I'm not quite sure about why that happens, but I'm not sure that it's the individuals that are really the problem. I think it's partly the system itself, maybe, and certainly what gets sort of pushed in the training. It's almost more that, hail fellow, well met. It's Saturday and Sunday and you're still in here, or should be. I don't know. But I get what you're saying, because even individually, everybody is really busy and there's not a lot in the system that provides opportunities for groups to meet, to provide that kind of support. Like, I guess if you're in a recovery program, the Caduceus group is available. But if you're not going through that kind of process, I'm not sure what else there is in terms of being provided as a group to come together.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, I think that's a perfect descriptor of some of the challenges. The other thing that comes to mind, I think, for both Amir and I on the surgical side, in surgery in general, as you know, we do things to patients, and you're right. What you said earlier was beautifully said in terms of, we didn't cause the illness in the patient to put them on the table in front of us. But when you have a bad outcome as a surgeon, it can be very difficult, obviously, to deal with. And for some of us that do extremely risky surgery or high morbidity surgery, those bad outcomes happen not infrequently. I think there is a nuance as well, and Amir can comment on this for sure, which is when someone comes in, for example, in my hat as a trauma surgeon, and they're bleeding from a car crash or a gunshot, that's and the outcome is poor. That's quite frankly, it's an easier scenario to deal with than the pancreas cancer that comes into the clinic that we take to the operating room and has a postoperative complication and dies. So same end, but to your point, the process is very, very, very different. And I think the latter is much more difficult than the former.
For sure. If somebody comes in from a trauma, I mean, I would imagine it's quite different than if they walked in and they're smiling and chatting and then, they're, put under anesthetic and then they don't wake up. I'm sure that's quite different. But so it's less obvious that it's not your fault in some ways. Being in medicine in general is really difficult, but I think surgery is a particularly difficult one. I mean, I had some involvement with pediatric oncology at one point, and it's another area where it's really painful and hard. But even that is sort of a bit different as well, I think. It's hard. It's hard work to do, right? Like, this is not an easy field to work in, and we're so lucky that some people are willing to take it on. I just wish that there was a way that the whole process could be maybe a little different in terms of recognizing the humanity and the needs and the importance of attending to all of the individual and not just, paying attention to what they know. I understand why the emphasis is on developing the sort of knowledge base and the skill base too. But all of that resides within an individual. And the better we can take care of the entire organism, then, that knowledge and skill is resting in a container that is going to be able to survive all the other emotional and psychological stresses that are presented. And there's going to be a lot of them.
I mean, I know you're not in charge of our training system, but if you had to make some changes, what changes would you make?
Why don't I just identify some things that I've heard, right, from medical trainees? So, I understand why people are on call. I get that, because you also have to be able to perform in suboptimal situations and both internal and external. So, stretching that out a bit is probably important. Well, I do think it's important, but just even simple things, I think, to start with, like lunch, making sure there's a lunch, making sure people go to the bathroom, right? And making people feel like it's okay to do that. So that's really simple ones. Sometimes I hear of really grueling schedules where people are on nights for like a month. And that's really hard, especially if you have a family. And I don't know why, but I've heard things like, well, it would be really hard to plan the schedule with all these different people. And so we do these long things because it just gets it over with. And it's like, yeah, it gets it over with in a really grueling way. Like maybe if it was a week on and a week off or 2 weeks on, then surely we can do something with, like, we've got AI now, like feed the data into an AI program and let them figure it out, right? So there's some of that. Maybe, having more dedicated time when they have to study for your exams rather than have to fit it all in around other things. And some departments are better than that than others. I really think if people, and when somebody has a bad outcome, like some heads of the department are wonderful at, sitting someone down and talking to them and really letting them process that. Others, not so good. Right. But if there was in those areas where it wasn't easy for the department head, like having somebody on staff that could do it. Like I worked with the School of Medicine for, 5 or 6 years, and like they sent everybody they wanted to me. Having a social worker that maybe even moved between departments or divisions might be helpful. But actually, if there were times I know you do some retreats, I've been at them, but I'm not sure if they're facilitated in a way that let people go below the surface, right? So you're not just like putting on a happy face and like, oh yeah, we're going to get that work-life balance worked out. Who knows? But actually let them sink a little bit deeper into their experience. So they actually, nobody wants to maybe open up that much, but if it wasn't considered a flaw, like it was sort of more normal and natural for people to be able to have these feelings and express these feelings. And then actually, is a good part of our humanity that things touch us deeply. And not everybody wants to go there. And I get that. But a lot of times the people I see for burnout are people who didn't want to go there until they found themselves there. And at that point, it was not very easy for them to pull themselves out of it. So I think some of those things, like really simple things, people like acknowledging that people need to have lunch and that they need to have bathroom breaks. And even if they have to scrub in again or whatever, I don't know. You can't leave if you're in the middle of an operation. I get that, but I don't know.
What you're saying is like simultaneously very simple and straightforward. And on the other flip side, it requires such a massive shift in our culture. It's not easy for us to do. Bev, one of the things I want to talk to you about, or we want to talk to you about, is like in the absence of changing our culture, which, I must say, I think we're very hopeful with the way things are going, that things are changing. We had someone on the podcast, Haitham Kafarani, who talked about building this peer support system and his whole work is called Surgeons and Second Victim. And so they had a whole peer support system that would seek out people immediately after a bad event without them asking for it and say, hey, would you like to chat with one of our peer supports? So I'm very hopeful that things will change. But in the absence of that, I think one of the things we wanted to chat with you about is how do we build resilience in ourselves during these tough moments? Because they're going to come. Part, as we've talked about, it's part of the profession, part of the vocation that we've chosen. That's a big question and a very general, and no one size fits all. But are there things that you think are helpful for certain physicians and surgeons to know about, or to practice, or to think about when they're in those tough times?
I think so. First of all, if somebody has a belief in something greater than themselves, that is often very helpful. I mean, it's not something you can just, mandate or just scoop up if you don't have it. It is helpful if people have some kind of faith in something, because it really, the whole world isn't resting on your shoulders. A really wise woman once told me that anxiety is the price you pay for being your own higher power. And I really get that, because if it all comes down to you, whoa, that's a big strain. So that's one piece. But that's, not maybe something, I just wanted to bring it up. I'm certainly not somebody that's a great evangelist or anything like that. And I think that those sorts of things are really personal. But I think that is something that our culture has really moved away from at a real high cost. Aside from that, there's also this importance at being in the moment. I think a lot of medical training kind of sets you up from day one to first you got to be an undergraduate, and then you got to do your clerkship, and then you got to get a residency, and then you're going to do a fellowship. And your life is always going to happen somewhere later, right? Like you're always moving towards what's going to be. And so I think sometimes there's too much emphasis on the destination and not much attention to the journey. Included in that is the capacity to be present outside of the operating room. Because I know that when you're operating, you're exquisitely attentive and focused in the moment. But sometimes that skill kind of gets left at the operating door. There isn't such an emphasis on really learning how to be present in the moment in your daily life. Because as much as you are in the operating room, that isn't where you live most of your life. Most of your life is outside. And so learning to be present in each moment, I think, really brings a resiliency to you as an individual. Learning to sort of reconfigure your relationship with the idea of success or failure, or just, I think, learning to respect and honor what is happening right now as exactly what it should be, rather than somehow not quite right because it's not fitting some ideal of what you thought it would be. So being present inside and outside of the operating room. Often when I used to teach meditation, I used to say, you guys all know how to do this. You're expert at it, right? When you're in that operating room, you are so singularly focused in that moment. You're not thinking about, going shopping or what you're going to do on the weekend. And if it does pop in your head, I'm sure you're getting it out quite quickly and coming right back, right? But when you're stepping outside of that room, bringing that same skill to bear, and that each moment of your life is just as important as that moment when you're in the operating room. Like it's all your life. It's equally important. It's equally sacred. Right? Tucking your kids into bed, hugging your wife, having a fight. It's all sacred, right? Like it's all exquisitely precious. And realizing that and honoring that, I think does build resilience. Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, it's the real thing. So it's not just what you're doing to get to the next, or the next operation, or the next important moment.
That is such a wise series of statements. It really hits home for me personally. I, like many of us in surgery, did multiple fellowships, and my training paradigm, or essentially my training pathway, was very, very long. And ex-wife, who obviously my partner at the time, that saying or that slogan came out of my mouth thousands of times, I'm sure. And I genuinely believe that each stage of the pathway would get better and I would have more control. But you're exactly right. On many levels, missed the moment. Was hardly ever in the moment outside of the operating room. And it certainly had a big impact for me, again, personally in my life. And the other side of it, coming out of it, the epiphany of being able to appreciate the moments has really been a gift. And it may have come to me in my life late, but it's something, sort of that whole process. And really what you've talked about is something I talk to a lot of trainees about now, particularly as they get a little bit more senior. And it really is a narrative that's built into our profession that things get better and easier and more controllable as you go. But if you're an all-in person on the clinical side within the culture of surgery, it's often not accurate.
It's ironic, isn't it, that somehow the more dedicated you are to what you're doing, sometimes it makes it more difficult to value your own life outside of that room in the same way that you acknowledge how important being in that room is. But I think you're incredibly generous, and I think you hit on a really important thing. I do think the system is changing and improving, but I think it's, you guys that will make that happen more than anything. Your willingness to share your personal experience and to tell them what you've learned as a result of, maybe having difficulty valuing your own lived experience outside of the room as much as you do what you do in the room. I think that will really help change the experience for people who are just starting out. It's very powerful to hear someone being willing to be generous enough to say what you just said. I think that's incredibly helpful to young people coming in. It's hard though, because it sounds like it was really expensive. It's really hard when you lose a relationship that you care about or that you had great love for. I mean, I think, in many ways, my marriage was a casualty of medicine too, which is, I think, why John and we got through the initial stages. Came back. He's a very wonderful person. He's a lovely man. And we've worked together very hard trying to help support medical trainees so that they didn't meet the same weren't casualties in the same way.
Obviously talked about the impact on clinicians and physicians, but like the impact on your family, like they pay a price just as much as you do. And it's a hard thing to like kind of reconcile or kind of reflect on or think about, because you think it's an individual pursuit, but it's really not. And the deferral isn't really for yourself in some way. I mean, I can just talk for myself, I think Dr. Ball is the same way. Like when we're in the operating room, we love it. Like it's something that, people talk about these flow states. Like it is a flow state. You are in these flow states. It's beautiful. Like when you see that tissue puff up with the air, like you're in the right plane and things, like there is a joy and there's a beauty in those moments. And then you get to see people get better. So like that part of this, like the hunger and the sleep and the not going to the bathroom, like you can sort of deal with that. But then you defer all that time and the attention that you were supposed to give to the rest of your life and to the rest of your family, the things that ultimately, those are the things that probably will matter to us even more. I hope anyways, than our professional career. No, I don't know where the question is there, but it's just, that's the hard part.
I mean, I have no doubt that doctors love their family. I really do. But there is something, like, I think I understood it better when I started working and having my own patients and then later my own clients. There is an excitement and that is a clear sense of meaning and purpose. And, if you've worked hard at your skill set and, you can see that you can make a difference. There's something a little bit intoxicating about it in a way. But it's like, there's one piece I would argue a little bit. Yeah, I mean, yes, you can ignore the fatigue and the hunger and everything short term. But long term, I think it does take its toll on you guys too. But in terms of the family, there's a lot of waiting, from speaking as like a wife. It was always, it'll get better, it'll get better, it'll get better. No, it won't. It'll get better again. No, it won't. It'll get better, it'll get better. No, it won't. Like, there was always a child dying. And that's the truth. There always is a child dying. And it's a child. So, you'd feel, as a wife, you'd feel really selfish about saying, damn it, come home. Like, you're missing your children growing up, right? And then feeling really selfish and guilty and bad because you're not supporting, your partner that you love. And so it is really quite a difficult balance to be the wife or the husband of somebody who's, in medicine. And I think it happens on both sides. I've seen women who were doctors and their husbands stayed home. And, it happened for them too, right? So, so again, that sort of comes into that work-life balance. But I think that what can help, again, it's hard because then you get out of the operating room, you go home and you're exhausted, right? You want to fall asleep because you're exhausted. But if there's ways to make your time with your family sacred and to be present with as much energy or intensity. And I don't even know that it would have to be all the time because that wouldn't be probably sustainable. But, that expression I gave at the office, like, we really have to make sure that we bring something home to give to our partner too. And I think we want to, but I know even now, I mean, I'm semi-retired and I still I'll come out of a session that was, I often go over, I'm terrible at that, but it's like, I have somebody waiting for me when I come out of that office, right? And sometimes, it's important for me to remember that. It's, they're very patient with me and everything, but it's, you just have to remember that all of your life counts. Like, all of your life is equally important as anything you do in the room. And for me, my office, my studio is my operating room, right? But what I do outside of this room is just as important for me to be present. Being present doesn't mean that I'm happy or excited or I've got tons of energy, but, still whatever I'm bringing out, just being present with my partner and not shutting myself off or blanking out. And if I'm doing that, it probably means I need to take care of myself a bit more so that I can be present. I'm probably overextending myself in my work. That's hard not to do because I love my work. I really do. Like, I'm incredibly lucky to do my work. I love it as much now as the first day I started.
Oh, that's amazing. You've touched on so many amazing things, in that commentary. There's so many directions we could go, but in the interest of time, from my point of view, I just want to ask you one more question, which is, we've had a group of not only local but national surgeons and really international surgeons, unfortunately, pass away from, I guess, luckily, old age and things recently. And in some very quiet but profound, at least impactful on me, conversations with these folks before they die. One of the questions I've asked each of them, honestly, is sort of outlining how they transitioned out of surgery, i.e., retirement, for lack of a better sort of all-encompassing word. And I've been really surprised that no matter how internationally famous they were or weren't, whether anyone would know them outside of a given city or whether everyone in the globe knew them, the sentiment has been quite similar, almost uniformly, that they wish they had retired or stopped or slowed earlier. And they felt regret for a lot of the things you're commenting on, in particular, parts that they missed, and wishing they had at least re-engaged things before their health started to fail a little bit earlier. I'm curious what your thoughts are, having worked with physicians for so long at the back end.
It's interesting. I was at a garden party, a retirement garden party for someone, and I met a psychiatrist, a wonderful psychiatrist, and he was saying, it was so hard to retire because this is who I was, and if I wasn't a doctor, I wasn't quite sure who I was. And I get that. And I've always been, I've thought about it as well in terms of if you train really hard for so long to develop a skill set, and if you're good at it, it'd be hard to step back from that. And yet, I think being able to keep both parts of your life fully sacred helps support that transition of stepping away. I mean, he was a wonderful man and had a great life as well, and he made that transition. But I have seen it be really difficult for doctors when they do have to step back and wonder who they are, aside from being a doctor. And so I think if we keep both sides really important to us, that can help smooth that transition, because we don't have all of our eggs in one basket.
Bev, we could spend another hour with you, but we really want to thank you again for spending the time with us and really telling us some important truths that we need to hear and we need to remind ourselves of. So we really appreciate that. One of the questions that we ask our guests is, if you could go back in time and give yourself advice when you were just starting out in practice, what advice would you give yourself? And maybe I'll add one more element to that. If there was one piece of advice that you could give to physicians starting out their career to have a healthy career going forward, what would that advice be?
Never lose your sense of humor about your own personal narrative. Don't take yourself too seriously all the time. Yeah. These are who we are. It's really just a story that we're spinning out, and it's not who we are. We're much bigger than that story we're telling ourselves. And so if you can hold that story lightly and, sometimes be amused by it a little, I think it's easier to be balanced. You don't get too high and you don't go too low.
This too shall pass. Thank you so much, Bev. You've been listening to Cold Steel, the official podcast of the Canadian Journal of Surgery. If you have comments or questions, please email us at podcast.cjs@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.